And with this, I will invite Dima and Jesica to come front here and maybe already deliver the presentation on all the work on accreditation. And then they will also have the joy to manage the panel. So please.
Good morning. Okay. Well done. Okay. They're awake. I'm Jessica, for those who don't know me, and I was on the global coordination team for a bit of time, maybe 2 years, and then focused specifically in some countries on accreditation. Dima, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Dima Reda, and I've been working on accreditation. I used to work at the Adaptation Fund, where I managed the accreditation process for the Adaptation Fund, and then launched on my own in 2015 and started helping with GCF accreditation work. And with this program, I've been working in Nepal and the Philippines. Okay, so why the marshmallow challenge with accreditation? So I also think that accreditation is a contact sport. It is a very difficult process that countries have to go through. What ends up happening a lot of times is that entities get overwhelmed by the amount of information that they have to produce, the amount of the different areas of expertise that they have to bring to the table. And the way the application is put out, it does seem like there's only one solution to filling out the application, that you have to produce the exact policy and paper that the GCF has put out as examples. But the truth is that each organization is very different. And the idea behind accreditation is also to bring entities to the table that are different, that may do different types of projects than your typical implementing agency. So you have to be a little bit creative in that process as well. There may be ways to meet the standards that are not necessarily the exact thing that the World Bank, the exact standard that the World Bank would have. And the GCF actually does accept that, but you do need some type of facilitation and help in trying to figure out that roadmap and that road plan. And there is still a lot of back and forth, that iterative process of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work. So I think that's one of the things that's very similar to this. The other thing is that you do need a strong team. So you have to have leadership. Like you saw the CEO teams, they did well. But you can't just have the leadership involved. You have to have people on the ground who really understand what's going on within the organization, what's going on with the accounting, what's going on with the audit, the project side, the environmental and social safeguards, the gender. It brings together a wide range of people within an organization. And what I have found is that the management who puts together a small team of 4 or 5 people, more junior level staff, and empowers them to get the information they need, that application usually works much faster because you have that energy, but they also have the mandate. So they go and they say, hey, the CEO wants this. So people listen and give them the information they need. And then the third thing is that I think in the whole process, because the accreditation process can be all-consuming, we often forget the marshmallow. And in this case, the marshmallow is accessing funding. So you're working to get to the goal of accreditation, and then once you hit the finish line, where's the project? There hasn't been really a thought process of what are we actually going to do once we get accredited. So that's why I wanted to start with this, because I think it's a nice way to kind of think through that there are creative ways about it. Like accreditation does seem like a one-stop-fits-all. It's a paper application that has check boxes, but there are creative ways to think about it. And that it does bring the organization together, the different units, in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect when you first walk into the process. Now, one of the big challenges with direct access is that only 17% of approved projects are being done through direct access. So again, while we may be pushing to have more entities accredited, we're still not getting the amount of funding channeled through direct access that we would like to. So we're going to explore some of those issues, and I will turn over to Jess.
Thanks.
About why.
Can I borrow this? So we wanted to talk about the purpose of accreditation. Why go through this process? And as Dima said, you can't forget the marshmallow at the end. The initial thinking, I think, in the beginning, and what countries typically come into this thinking is we're going to get money for our organizations that do climate change projects. And they want to put forward those institutions that are familiar with mitigation or adaptation. But really, when you look at Thank you. Really, when you look at the GCF application, it's a lot more about the funding process. They're looking for fund managers for those entities that have strong fiduciary standards and strong environmental and social safeguard protections for the projects that they're funding. And so in reality, it's both of these things. And it's also a lot of stakeholder consultation and being able to understand and monitor the results of the project, because ultimately that entity is the entity that's accountable to the GCF. And so while the GCF application focuses on this middle part, the fund management and all of its criteria, the reality is we need to focus on a much broader set of problems and a much broader set of qualities that these entities need to have to be successful. So the first question and the first challenge is typically DAEs that are nominated are either fund managers or development banks or their commercial banks, or they're project developers, they're NGOs that are familiar with climate change projects, but they're rarely both. So when accreditation sometimes feels like death by 1,000 cuts, I heard that yesterday, and it really resonated with me. I often got, even when these applicants were nominated by the NDA because they had requested to be, halfway through the process, they would say, why are we doing this? We forget. And it's certainly not for the accreditation stamp, because it's not like certified organics. It doesn't really bring you any value just to be accredited. It's also usually not for just the 10% or 8% that the project developer fee that comes with the projects. So it needs to be about channeling resources for the country. And therefore, it's not just about the entity and their own goals, but about broader country goals. And that requires a lot more nuance in thinking about the problem that they face as accredited entities. I'll turn it over. That's you. Oh, sorry, I have one more before I turn it over. The other thing is that these national entities are often less capacitated and have less resources and are operating at a national standard. But what the GCF asks them to do is meet this international global standard for fund management and for ESS. And that can be extremely difficult. And even international organizations like UNEP, like UNDP, Claudia's nodding, struggle to do this because it really is the highest bar in the land. And we're asking often very small and nationalized organizations to meet this bar with and develop a track record in it. And that is not the easiest thing to do.
I can keep that. And I just will add to what Jess is saying. One of the areas that almost every organization struggles with is the environmental and social safeguard standards. And as we know, that is a relatively new standard that has to be met across the international organizations. So at the GCF, when they introduced the environmental and social safeguards, there were a number of international agencies that were part of the GCF that had to develop a whole set of standards so that they had those standards in place. We had the World Food Programme apply to the Adaptation Fund as an entity, and they didn't have environmental and social safeguard standards yet in place. So they had to develop those themselves as well. So this is it's great to push organizations to meet this, but we also have to be cognizant that some of this is very new, and the GCF part of the good part about getting accredited is that you start to meet these international standards for your organization. So then the third critical challenge is that accreditation has a cost. So even when an organization is being supported through a program like this, or through a readiness program, or the government is supporting the process, there are a lot of costs to the organization, just in terms of manpower, in terms of sometimes, like in Nepal, the organizations carried out all of their own translations. They bore those costs themselves. And then the time that it takes, there's a lot of work and effort that gets put into it. And that is, of course, part of the cost. And then the final challenge is that there's a real shift when you become an implementing entity in how you think about your role in projects and programs. And to me, this is part of the transformational change, the paradigm shift, whatever we want to call it, of the GCF, of this direct access modality. You're moving organizations, instead of just thinking of themselves as a vessel to take in money from the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank, that they are going to be proactive. They're going to design their own projects. They're going to use their own systems. It's completely transformational. It's a completely different mindset that they are undertaking. And that's a learning curve. So even as you're going through the accreditation process, you're not really going to understand the full impact of that until you start doing your first project and bringing those stakeholders to the table. And to me, this is the biggest benefit of accreditation, is that a lot of these organizations have been handling large sums of money from at the outside, and it's really their turn now to do it on their own.
Okay, so we wanted to talk about a couple case studies, and the first one is Fiji. Fiji elected the Fiji Development Bank, and it was actually written into the country programs we discussed yesterday. So there wasn't an open call for applications. There wasn't an initial screening like there were in some countries. It was decided that FDB should be the entity that we work with. And that made sense because they were a big provider of development finance in the country. But it also meant that there was only one entity, and they were the forerunners that we worked with. We did a mission there, 2 missions before we submitted the application, a 3-day ESS and gender workshop. I don't think any of our entities had a gender policy, and Fiji was no exception before we started working with them. And then went back and did a second mission before it was submitted, or resubmitted, because as we all know, this takes multiple rounds of iteration. And that kind of led to some pros and cons in the approach there. The pros is that they did select the appropriate entity. They had full resources, they were committed, they knew that they were the development provider in the country. And the top management was really involved. We had the general manager for business risk services and actually an intern who was, both of them were very instrumental on the team in putting together the application and getting all the information from across the house. The con there was that there wasn't necessarily a transparent selection process. And so, when you're pointed to and asked by the government to undertake this role, rather than ask the government to nominate you for this role, there's differences in your motivation level for doing that. Fiji overcame this by a long shot, but in some countries that was an issue. And then the second thing is, where is Fiji's role in project development? Typically their projects were real estate and tourism development. And they had to learn quite a lot about climate change in order to fully understand why they were getting into this role. So the ultimate outcome was that they were accredited. But I want to really draw your attention to this part of the quote. After the 3-day ESS workshop, Nafi, and I was there when he said it, said, we want to be, and he was being partially facetious, but I think also quite serious, we want to be the green bank for Fiji. And he had said at the time that we want to roll out the ESS across all of our portfolio so that we meet these environmental and social standards on all of our projects. And that really hit home for me because that was a benefit well beyond what the GCF can bring to the table. Even if they don't get a project, the standards in terms of environmental and social safeguards in Fiji hopefully are going to be higher and continue to do so after the work that they undertook in this training and to develop their own environmental, social, and gender policies.
Okay, and then we also have Nepal. And Nepal was quite different because we did do a call for entities. When I first went there, we didn't have a project coordinator in place. So it was a very slow process. Once Yalamber came on board, and he'll be on the panel so you can ask him specific questions, things finally started to move forward. So we were able to put out the call for entities who were interested. Now in that first round, one of the major difficulties that we had is that all of the entities that applied for accreditation had major gaps, not just small ones here or there, but very, very significant gaps. But we wanted to do something with the project is running out of time. We want to make sure that we selected. So we selected the technical working group. We did a gap analysis of all of the entities and selected the 2 that had the least number of gaps against the accreditation standard and that were also suited to do projects that the government wanted to do. So one was the Alternative Energy Promotion Center, which does renewable energy and works a lot with all of the districts in Nepal and the rural areas as well. And then the National Trust for Conservation, which is an NGO, does a lot smaller projects, but focuses a lot on adaptation and community-based ecosystem adaptation. So two very different organizations that would do very different projects, but that are aligned with what the government is interested in doing. So those 2 entities are now in stage 2. As Yalumber said yesterday, when the NDA was able to go to, was it Bali? Correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, it clicked for him, oh my God, why didn't we think of the Town Development Fund? Because they would be a perfect entity. And they are a very strong entity. Their gaps are much less against some of these standards. So, and they work in a very different sector than also AEPC and NTNC. So they could do a different type of portfolio of projects for the government. And that, working with municipalities and urban areas, can do like green city work, urban type, sustainable development type work. And then they also really wanted to look at a private bank to try and access different financial instruments. So we had a number of private sector banks that applied, and that was a very difficult selection because they all are regulated by the central bank, so they're pretty similar in terms of the standards. So the final decision was based on the history and the longevity of the bank that was selected, as well as the reach that it had across the country. So being able to get resources to very different parts of the country. So some of the pros of this process was it was a very transparent process. The call went out in the local papers. And the technical committee was very strategic in how they wanted to select the entities. They had a very clear vision of what types of projects they wanted each entity to do, which hopefully will serve well if we ever get accredited with any of these. And then the cons, the difficulty is that they have major gaps. Nepal is an LDC, and we're moving to help fill those gaps. And then there was also a gap in the support to the entities. So for AEPC and NTNC, we submitted the stage 1 application. We were able to get the first round of questions, able to help them with that. And then there was kind of a gap in terms of their being able to get assistance once they moved into stage 2. So now with this new GCF readiness support, hopefully that can be provided with that for them. So some of the key takeaways. Holding a transparent selection process that includes a gap analysis is really useful, and it also allows the entities to have a better understanding of what they're getting themselves into. For the countries, it probably makes more sense to invest longer term and only with a few entities, and to have kind of a sense and a vision of what the portfolio is that this accredited, the direct access accredited entity will do. Because if you're going to go through this whole process and you're only thinking of just one project, it doesn't necessarily make sense to go through all of that pain for one project. You also have to ensure that the DAE, that the top management understands what its role is in accreditation. And as Jess was saying, they can't think of it as just a pot of money for themselves, for their organization to plug in some budget holes or programming holes that they might have. It really has to be thought of as we are doing this on behalf of the country and to drive climate finance into the country through this direct access modality. And they do, even if they are a small entity, committing their own resources, even in a small way, putting together a team that's dedicated, doing their own translations, it really helps to see that they have ownership of that process.